apocalyptic literature. We talked about how pervasive the use of the Old Testament is in the book of Revelation. And we talked about some of the imagery that's important to recognize in reading the book. And we talked about, I think, how Revelation teaches the same message as the rest of the New Testament. It's not some weird esoteric new piece of sort of mysteries to decode, so much as it is a very different way of telling the same story as the rest of the New Testament. So Revelation is a piece of apocalyptic literature, and all that we talked about last time. Not going to go over that again. But Revelation, the book of Revelation, is also a letter sent to 7 churches. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to just look at the letters to the churches as a lens through which we can helpfully read the rest of the book, okay? I think this is really helpful. So I think it's really helpful to remember that the book of Revelation is an apocalyptic. The rest of the book of Revelation is embedded in the letters to the churches themselves. So, and so I want to think about what it would, we're going to look at a bunch of examples of this, what it would be like to get the book of Revelation. Let's say you were from the church at Pergamum or Thyatira or Philadelphia or something like that, and you get the book of Revelation, you're reading it for the first time, and here's your letter, and you're like, this is amazing, right? Hi, Giovanni. Yeah, I can't come back there right now. And you're reading your letter, and then you read the rest of the book, and you see some of the same stuff pop up in the visions and all the so-called crazy stuff, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, how would that hit you if you've read some of those things in the letter that Jesus sent to you, to your church, right? So that's part of how we're supposed to think about this. And the letters help part of the way they serve as a lens to read the rest of the book is that they hammer home the main point of the book of Revelation, the main goal. The main goal of Revelation is not speculation. It's not trying to figure out on some sort of detailed chart what's going to happen when. But the main goal of the book is actually ethical. It's practical. It is, the goal of the book of Revelation is to try to help readers, to exhort readers to be faithful, to be people who conquer. And this refrain is repeated again and again in all the letters. Be someone who conquers. And the rest of the book of Revelation is just the rest of the way of trying to show you, to give you a way of viewing the world that helps you to realize what's really going on so that you will stay faithful to Jesus despite the beast and despite the prostitute. All right? And another couple introductory ideas. The letters to the churches would have functioned as a lens through which the first readers should read and apply Revelation there for us today. And another thing they help us remember is that the book of Revelation was meant to be read and understood by its first century people. Okay? Revelation, therefore, is not a book that only means something in the 23rd century once we have all the right technology and all the sort of newspapers line up with what we're reading in the book, right? The book of Revelation was meant to be understood by churches in the late 1st century. And we know that because it's appended to letters to them, right? It's given to them to read, and the imagery of the book is interwoven between the letters and the rest of the book. So I want to spend some time going through the different letters and imagining how the first hearers of the book, and they'd be hearers, not readers, right? This would be probably, they'd get one copy and it would be read to them in church. So imagine how the first readers would be extra attuned as they read their letter and then go through the rest of the book and they see stuff popping out. And they go, oh my goodness, wow, right? They're not going to be thinking, I wonder how this applies in several hundred years. They'd be thinking, whoa, this is what Jesus just told us about in our letter. We better pay attention and be faithful. So I'm going to give you guys, I'll give you guys 5 minutes to briefly kind of glance through the 7 letters to the churches, just as a little warm-up. And I want you to, just from your knowledge of Revelation, I want you to just take 5 minutes and think about, you can do this in pairs, you can do this if if you want to do this by yourself, that's fine. If you want to, there's the different personality types. Some people like to do stuff with a group of 15 people. Other people like to be holed up by themselves. So whatever you want to do. But just glance through the letters to the churches and think about, from your knowledge of the rest of Revelation, is there stuff in here that you're like, wait a minute, I kind of recall that from somewhere later in the book? Okay? That's all I want you to think about. Does that make sense? You think it makes? Okay, good. So I'll give you 5 minutes starting now. And I'm not expecting you to come up with any exhaustive list in 5 minutes, but just to get your mind going. Okay, 2 minutes left. Okay, 30 seconds. This is the time that I occasionally in my class will turn on Jeopardy music. Okay, now we're going to go through briefly some of the imagery that I've found in these, and the exhortations in these letters that sort of connect to the rest of the book, starting with Ephesus. And I'm going to ask for things that you may have found. So, in the letter to the church in Ephesus, what did any of you guys notice and hear that maybe you recall reading in the rest of the book of Revelation? Anyone? Be brave, be bold. Okay, which is from right before it, right? Is what Jesus just had talked about right earlier. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Tree of life. Yes, right. Okay, so that's big. So let's think about this. So the letter to the first letter to the church, the letter to the first church, basically kicks off the book of Revelation with this reference to sort of one of the very, very last things in the book of Revelation, right? So at the very end of Revelation is this vision of the new heavens and new earth and the new Eden, the restored Eden, where God's holy people will finally dwell in this new creation and once again have access to the tree of life, right? This is the vision that the book of Revelation closes with, right? But again, this isn't just some vision that's meant to be like, oh, that's awesome. Like, this is great. This is where we put this at the end of our chart of events. But it's in the very first letter to the seven churches. This is in verse 7. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And then the Ephesians keep reading or listening to the rest of Revelation, and they come to the end. And they hear about the tree of life in chapter 22. And they're reminded that this is what Jesus told them in their letter, that they need to be those who overcome, who conquer, what does that mean practically for them? It means to restore the love that they used to have, right? That they've lost. The love for each other. They had been known for being a church that loved Jesus and loved each other well, but of late they've become known as maybe a church that is very, very concerned about being doctrinally correct, but not so much about being loving. And Jesus says, if you want access to the tree of life, if you want to see yourself in the vision at the end of the book of Revelation, you need to restore that love, that chief fruit of the Spirit, right? Make sense? Okay. Anything else in the letter to the church at Ephesus? Notice also, so Jesus sort of reprimands them for the love issue, but right away he does commend them for their patient endurance in verse 2 and 3. How they've patiently toiled and sort of not put up with evil, with pseudo-apostles and stuff like that, right? And this call or this commendation, this idea of faithful endurance is something that recurs elsewhere in the book. So in chapter 13, verse 10, for example, we're reading about the beast. And this beast has all these heads, right? And he comes out of the water, and he was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority is given to him over every tribe and people and language and nation. This is a sort of the parody of the Messiah. This is like the anti-Messiah figure. And everyone who dwells on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life. And wow, this is terrifying, right? This is like, oh my goodness, this beast is going to pressure people so hard. And then what do we read in verse 10? Here is a call for the endurance and faithfulness or faith of the saints. And then in the next chapter, in chapter 14, we read about the beast and Babylon falling, finally being judged and destroyed, and the smoke of their torment going up forever and ever for all those who have received the mark of the beast, okay, which we talked about last time. It just means that they're in their hearts, they've been branded as loyal to the beast, right? And then again, here is a call for the endurance of the saints, right? So those pictures of there's this beast and there's this mark of the beast and there's this terror of pressure to conform and whatever, is not something for the future necessarily. I mean, not just for the future, but it's something that the Ephesian church is being commended for how they have exhibited patient endurance, right? All that imagery is not speculation. It's ethical. It's meant to impact real lives of real people in real churches in the first century all the way to the 21st and beyond. Make sense? Okay. Second letter, Smyrna. Okay, anybody find anything interesting in the letter to the Smyrnans? I don't know if that's the word. We'll say it is. Anybody? There's some interesting stuff here. Pardon? The second death. Yes. So what does it say about... So this is verse 11, right? So Jesus says, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. And then we read much later in the book, in chapter 20, about the second death, the final destruction, the final judgment, the final, final punishment. And again, that vision in the future is brought into the present through this letter. Be faithful, conquer, because what you read about in chapter 20 about all these creatures, all these humans and stuff that are being, thrown into the lake of fire as the second death. That isn't something just as interesting information, but it's you, right? That story is the story of you, or not, right? Be faithful. Now, this is in the context of this is a pretty dark situation. I know your tribulation and your poverty, and the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not. Don't fear what you are about to suffer. The devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days, a figurative amount of time, you will have tribulation. Be faithful to death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, think of the Smyrnans reading this letter, thinking of their friends who have just been put in prison, realizing that things are getting pretty dark in their town, in their area. And then they go on and read the rest of this letter, and they read about how the beast... actually, we just read that, right? They read about how the beast is given the authority, the ability to fight against the saints and to conquer them. And they know that's them now, right? That what that looks like for the beast to be given leeway to conquer the saints means that friends from their church are going to prison, and that some of them will be martyred, right? It's these everyday, really dark realities of them suffering and them weeping and them feeling like their numbers are dwindling and that they are being overcome by the beast, right? It's their real experience. This is what Jesus says in sort of this plain language here in their letter. Don't fear what you are about to suffer. The devil is about to throw some of you into prison, and you will have tribulation. This word tribulation shows up later in the book, right? This is an important word in apocalyptic literature. In chapter 7, verse 14. So when it speaks of the 144,000 representing all of God's people who have been stamped with Jesus' name on their heads, and that is another way of looking at that is that the multitude from every tribe, people, and nation. And one of the elders in chapter 7, verse 13, asks, saying, "Who are these people clothed in white robes, and where have they come from?" And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of great tribulation." That's the same word that the Smyrnans have just read in their letter from Jesus. Jesus says, "You will have tribulation." And then they read chapter 7, and they hear this encouragement that, yes, Jesus has just told them they will have tribulation, but he's also shown them this vision of all of God's people who come out of great tribulation reigning as God's people forever, right? See, does that make sense? Revelation was not meant to be read by a bunch of speculators. It's meant to be read by a bunch of churches. Taking this vision and saying, this is what it means for us to be faithful. Okay. Verse 11. No, sorry. Verse 10. Be faithful to death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, this sort of resonates with a bunch of other imagery in the book of Revelation, which speaks of Jesus reigning over the earth, but not just Jesus' people. So in chapter 5, verse 10, for example, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. You were slain," etc. Verse 10, "You have made them, your people, a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Right? This is another way of envisioning the promise that Jesus has just given to this church. Be faithful to death, and I will give you the crown of life. You will reign on the earth in the new creation. Okay. There's so much more here. In Smyrna, there's a reference to Jesus as the one who died and came to life, right? Which in chapter 5 is going to be pictured the same thing as the lamb coming out looking as though he had been slain, right? It's another way of picturing that same thing. Okay. Anything from Pergamum? We're not going to spend much time in Pergamum, the letter to Pergamum, but any observations from the letter to the church at Pergamum? Okay. Yes. Okay. So Ryan points out that Jesus here verse 16 is what you're thinking of. I will come to you soon and war against you with the sword in my mouth. Is that? And 12. The words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. Yeah, so Jesus is depicting himself as this one who has the sharp two-edged sword or the sword that's kind of the sword of his word, right? That's coming out of his mouth and destroying. And this then is picked up in chapter, did you say 13? I said 13. Okay. I think 19 maybe? Yep. Okay, so 19, where Jesus says, well, no, not Jesus says. This time, it's this picture of this white horse, and the one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and he's going out to make war. And he is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and he's called the Word of God. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of God's anger. Whoa, okay? Now again, that's like, man, this cosmic Jesus character coming out on this horse with a sword, that's crazy. Yeah, fine. But it's that same image that Jesus wants the church at Pergamum to be thinking about with how it relates to them, right? Because he says to them, you guys here who have latched on to the teachings of this false prophet, he's referring to him as a Balaam character, And the people who hold the teachings, the mysterious teaching of the Nicolaitans, which we don't know much about, he says, you got to repent because otherwise I'm going to come and war against you with a sword in my mouth. And you're like, man, that's scary. And then you keep reading Revelation, you sort of forget about that, right? And then you come to chapter 19, and Jesus is coming out with the sword and making war, and you remember, oh, that's what Jesus told us we're going to be on the wrong side of if we don't repent, right? Make sense? This is how Revelation is supposed to work. The imagery in the book is supposed to be something that calls us to faithfully endure, to be one who overcomes. Okay. I'm going to, let's see. Great, that's all. Oh, man, all right. I'm going to have to skip some of that. Thyatira we're going to do at the end. It's the one in the middle, and I'm going to wait on that. Sardis. Okay, anything in Sardis?
Reference to having your name in the book of life.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so the one who conquers will be clothed in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life. Okay, and so the book of life imagery comes up again in chapter 13, chapter 17, and chapter 21, right? So that imagery of this a book of life or whatever is integrated into all the visions and stuff of the letter, but it's a reminder. What is it meant to do in part? It's meant for this church to be a reminder to them to be faithful to Jesus to the end, so that when that vision fully comes to pass, they will be those who will be found to have had their names written in the book of life, right? Okay, and also it speaks of them walking in white garments, which is imagery that appears in chapter 7 and chapter 19 of God's holy people who are washed in Jesus' blood and are victorious and wear white robes. Okay, and the church at Philly. Well, they probably didn't call it Philly back then. Okay, the door. Do you want to elaborate on that at all? The gates of the city that don't get that you're excluded from, or you can be in. Oh yeah, that's right. Oh yes. Yep, that's right. Okay. What else? Okay, in verse 7, Jesus is described as holding the key of David, and he opens and no one can shut. And this should remind us in chapter 5 of where it speaks of who can break open the seals that unleash God's final redemptive purposes. And who can open them up? The Lion of Judah, the descendant of David. He's conquered, and he has authority to open up all of the seals, right? It's the descendant of David who has the key, right? Who can unlock God's purposes. And so in the rest of the letter, it's all these purposes of judgment and salvation. Look at verse 12. I really like this one. To the one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from God out of heaven. Okay? Does this ring any bells? Yeah, because how does the letter end? So here Jesus says, if you're faithful, you'll be a pillar in God's temple. And you'll be part of this New Jerusalem. And at the end, this is precisely how the book of Revelation ends, with this vision of this angel coming to John saying, look, I'm going to show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. You're like, wow, here it comes. And then he turns and looks, and what does he see? This would be a shock to any groom on a wedding day, right? Looking for a bride, and you see a city, the New Jerusalem, right? But this city is a very strange city because and we talked about this, I think, maybe we talked about this? I don't know. we could spend a whole hour, 45 minutes on this. But the city is actually patterned after, it looks like the temple, right? So what is this? Who is the bride? Well, it's the New Jerusalem or God's new temple, right? And so this vision, ending the book of Revelation, the new heavens, new earth, God comes down and dwells with humankind, and the Lamb finally gets married to his bride, or another way of saying that is, the new temple is here. Jesus' people are the temple of God, right? God's dwelling so permeates his people on new creation that it's like the Holy of Holies in the Old Testament, right? And this letter to the Philadelphians reminds us, if you're faithful to Jesus, you're going to be a pillar in that temple. You will be part of that Holy of Holies, New Jerusalem community that you're going to read about in chapter 21 at the end of the letter, right? The images of the book, the vision of this book, are meant to shape who we are today. It's meant to say, if this is, yes, a strange vision, full of weird symbols and strange monsters, right? And numbers doing all sorts of odd tricks. But this is a vision of what is true and how it will end. And therefore, how are we to live in light of that vision? Okay? All right, now, Laodicea. The only thing I want to point out here, for sake of time, is the depiction of these folks as okay. So we all know this. This is always the favorite letter to preach, for whatever reason. You guys say, I am rich, I've prospered, I don't need anything, right? But you don't realize that you're quite wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. All right. So these people say, I'm rich, I've prospered, I don't need anything. Man. Now, what does that way of speaking sound like in the rest of Revelation? Does this ring any bells? Who goes around claiming to be rich and prosperous and not needing anything? Pardon? Yeah, Babylon. It's the harlot and her cronies. Oops. That's not good. So again, the Church of Laodicea is given this, hey, you guys, you think you're rich, you're prosperous, everything's, you don't need anything. Then you read the letter and you're like, all of a sudden you read about sort of the ultimate villains of the book, Babylon, right? Babylon is the opposite city of Jerusalem, right? In the book of Revelation, it's all the anti-God, anti-Jesus people. And they're lounging around, these businessmen, they're just like, they're super rich, they're fine with exploiting other people so that they can live high on the hog. They're just kicking back and just living a super, super indulgent life. They're the ones that are saying, man, we're rich, we don't need anything, everything's awesome. And then they get really, really surprised when all of a sudden Jesus shows up and destroys Babylon, right? And I think just the way this wording is here in the letter to the Laodiceans, when they come to that, they're going to be like, I think Jesus thinks that we're sort of acting like these people, right? That our way of being in the world is a little bit more like we align with these Babylon types. And that's not good, because we know how that story ends, right? Make sense? Okay, finally, the church at Thyatira. This is the one in the center. So in the 4 minutes left, I would ask you what you guys think, but I don't have time. So that's rude. Two things I want to point out. One, in chapter 2, verse 26. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. Now, that rod of iron language we've already read in one of the other passages I read from later in Revelation. This actually comes from Psalm 2. And Jesus, in Revelation 12 and Revelation 19, Jesus is the one who fulfills Psalm 2 as he rules over the nations with a rod of iron, but also he shares this rule with his people. And so these visions of Jesus coming and conquering the nations, ruling over the whole world in chapter 12, chapter 19, judging evil, bringing about new creation. Apparently, Thyatirans are promised that fulfillment of Psalm 2, you will share in Jesus' rule at the end, if you're faithful. And then finally, I want to close with this one. This is maybe seems strange. And I will give him the morning star. Those who conquer, who keep their faith in Jesus to the end, Jesus says, I will give you the morning star. Okay? Does that ring any bells from the rest of the book of Revelation? This word shows up only one other time in the whole New Testament, and it is at the very, 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 very end of the book of Revelation. What is the morning star? Well, it comes from this prophecy in Numbers, from Balaam of all people, saying that a scepter shall rise out of Judah and a star shall come out of Jacob, and he will rule God's people and conquer God's enemies. So it becomes this messianic promise. Jesus says, the one who overcomes, I will give him the morning star. Now, look at this in Revelation 22. Verse 16, I, Jesus, have sent my messenger, my angel, to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. If you conquer, Jesus says, I will give you myself. And yes, part of what that means is to share in my kingship, my rule. But most deeply and most profoundly, Jesus says, you are faithful and you get me. And that's the promise to the church at Thyatira and the promise to all of us. At the end of the day, trusting in Jesus, entrusting ourselves to the Lamb who was slain, and being faithful to him to the end, means, yes, we share in Jesus' rule, we share in all these great things, but first and foremost and only because Jesus says, the one who overcomes, I will give him the morning star. I will give him myself. And that's the ultimate promise and exhortation of the letters. Okay, so hopefully that helps you get a little bit of a sense of how the letters to the churches can serve as just a little bit of a lens. Doesn't answer all of our questions, but a little bit of a lens for how we're supposed to read the imagery and the exhortations in the rest of the book and apply them to ourselves today. Thank you so much.
While the children's classes come back, take 2 minutes to stand up, stretch, say hello to people around you, and we will convene in 2 minutes.